Hello. Ladies and gentlemen, can we be seated so we can start?
Gentlemen, please take your seats again. We are about to commence our next panel, which is panel 7, Demonstrating State Intent to Genocide. Our chair is Professor Azim Ibrahim from the Newlands Institute for Strategy and Policy. Welcome, Professor Ibrahim.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe, for this fantastic initiative, which has been a long time in the making. I remember when Joe first contacted me about this convention. Unfortunately, it had to be put on ice because of the global pandemic. But we have a fantastic panel for you today. Under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, the Commission of Genocide requires, and I quote, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a protected group. But there's a lot of confusion around this. Intent to destroy does not necessarily require explicit statements. It can be inferred from a collection of objective facts that are attributable to the state, including official statements, a general plan, state policy and law, a pattern of conduct, and repeated destructive acts which have a logical sequence and result, which is the destruction of the group. Statements, for example, round up everyone who should be rounded up, wipe them out completely, break their roots, break their connections, break their origins. But the key question today, what this panel is going to discuss, is how can we actually demonstrate intent of genocide based on the evidence that we have available? What evidence is there? How is this processed? What is the methodology? And what are the shortcomings of such an approach? Is this approach, is it open to abuse? And what are essentially the handicaps of this? And to discuss this and other matters, we have a stellar panel for you today, and I will introduce them one by one. Dr. Adrian ZENZ from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation requires no introduction. Everybody, I think, here knows him. He's been a pioneer in this work. Some of his earliest works has had the highest impact. He is the author of this seminal report on labour transfer and ethnic minorities, which had a huge impact. And it was first published. I believe he's a favourite of the government in China. I think you're #1 on their Christmas card list. Adrian will speak for 17.5 minutes precisely. He will be followed by Ondřej KLIMEŠ from the Oriental Institute of the Czech Academy of Science. Ondřej did his PhD at the Charles University in Prague. He specializes in the history and politics of modern China. He will then be followed by Dr. Elise Anderson, who's the Senior Program Officer at the Uyghur Human Rights Project in Washington. She lived in Xinjiang and in the Uyghur region for over 4 years, where she undertook original research for her doctoral thesis at the University of Indiana. And finally, last but certainly not least, Professor Sean Roberts, who's the Director of the International Development Program at the Elliott School of Government at George Washington University. Sean is the author of this seminal book, which is highly recommended, The War in the Uyghurs, which there's a display copy there for everybody to see. But this is a groundbreaking book that actually examines the linear progression in terms of how the Uyghurs, the Communist Party developed and executed its war on the Uyghurs. So I've been instructed, in fact I've actually been threatened to keep the time, not instructed, I've been threatened that I must keep the time very strictly. So without any delay at all, I'll pass it on to Dr. ZENZ.
Well, thank you indeed. And we shall be very precise. Let me get out my timer here. Okay, start. There we go, the seconds are ticking. So, very, very important topic and crucial topic on the question of intent in genocide, which has long been a very difficult question. For many years, I've been sort of the go-to person for journalists and the Uyghur community about the question of, is this genocide? Or what really is going on? Are people being killed? What's really going on? And my line for a long time was very consistent. I always said we have evidence of mass internment, but we have no evidence of mass killing, mass murder. And I also said that I never anticipated and never thought that this would actually descend into mass murder. Because, for example, if you compare to the Holocaust, Hitler had a different ideology, a different view of the Jews, in my opinion. If you look at the Zhonghua Minzu concept and the whole racial and ethnic policy and theory of the CCP, we see a strategy of assimilation. Last year, I published an important report about birth prevention, which sparked a huge international reaction, much bigger than I ever imagined. And people really started to use the word genocide, except not myself. I never outright called it a genocide. I called it a demographic genocide, which is sort of a non-technical term, just to hint that there's something going on here. I never, however, called it genocide. I did not change my mind on this topic until recently. It is only basically because for me the missing question was always the question of intent. We have evidence of birth prevention, even dramatic birth prevention, resulting in dramatically declining birth rates, but for a genocide determination according to the legal definition, you need to have some kind of idea, what is this about? What is the end game here that's behind this? So it is not until earlier this year, in May and June, when I published the draft version of the paper, titled as such shown here, that I determined for myself we have now pretty convincing and reasonably strong, if not completely smoking gun evidence, that there is an intent to commit genocide through systematic suppression of births, not through mass killing. So I just wanted to clarify that. Sometimes, especially in debates and controversy, I'm portrayed as somebody who really pushes an anti-China line, or who is sort of on the forefront of trying to portray a certain image. But I've actually been very, very careful myself with the term genocide. However, I do believe, and I will present this now, I do believe that the evidence we have now really is taking us to the next level. And this will be my presentation. So I need to remember to forward all the slides correctly. It seems to be working. So just a slight data update. We have incomplete data on Xinjiang's birth rates as they progressed from 2018 to 2019, which is the most recent data. However, the indication is quite clear that the birth rate decline by far was strongest in Xinjiang's ethnic minority counties, by 50%. And if we secondly look at natural population growth, which is birth rate minus death rate equals the natural growth of the population, the decline is even more dramatic than 50%, and that's obvious because this is a sample of southern Xinjiang counties again. Because with decreasing birth rates, natural population rates decline increasingly dramatically as they approach death rate. If the birth rate equals death rate, then population growth is 0, right? If the birth rate is just slightly higher than the death rate, then the natural population growth approaches 0, and the decline, of course, is all the more dramatic. So this is the current scenario. I don't have time for details. There are some Uyghur counties that have published negative natural population growth rates, either for the past or they have stated that they are planning to have a negative population growth rate. So that's the status quo. Now, the question, however, is what is the state's intent behind decreasing the birth rate? They can say, well, they have been too high, so we're just decreasing them, okay? We bring them down, maybe to the same level as the Han. Well, the data shows the level in Xinjiang is actually quite getting below the Han. But what is the goal, and when could this goal be achieved? So these are questions I hope to answer here. This research overlaps a little bit with James Leibold's work on population optimization. We published on this relatively, he published a little earlier on it. We must have been working on it at the same time without knowing about it, knowing that the other was working on it. There are some very important statements by academics who either are closely affiliated with the state, or their research is funded by the state, or they are so-called scholar cadres, meaning they are both scholars and hold official party positions. So this is not just an academic opinion. The Dean of the Institute of Frontier History at Durham University said in 2015 that the state needed to change the population structure and layout and end the dominance of the Uyghur ethnic group, which became the title of my research piece. He said in 2016 that the imbalance of the ethnic minority and Han population composition in southern Xinjiang reached an unbelievably serious degree. Now, there's many more such statements by many other academics, etc. But in my opinion, the most pertinent and the most high-profile statement by far comes from Liu Yilei. And it is when I saw this quote that I knew that I probably had a research paper, when I saw this particular text. He is not only the Dean of Xinjiang University, but also the Deputy Secretary General of the Party Committee of the ex-PCC, the Bingtuan one. He wrote, as recent as July 2020, after all the crackdown, after all the things, he basically wrote that the core problem in Xinjiang has not yet been solved. The core problem has not yet been solved. Quite a statement to make in July 2020, isn't it? He went on to say the problem in southern Xinjiang is mainly the unbalanced population structure. Population proportion and population security are important foundations for long-term peace and stability. The proportion of the Han in southern Xinjiang is too low, less than 15%. He refers to the 5 prefectures in the south, including Bayingol. The problem of demographic imbalance is southern Xinjiang's core issue. Quite interesting. A very illuminating, if lengthy, statement by Li Xiaoxia, a key figure. She's the one who wrote the rebuttal against my work, and she's written the official Xinjiang population report of 2021, earlier this year. She wrote in 2017 that the population gap between ethnic minorities and the Han continues to widen, which has made the concentration of a single ethnic group in certain regions, meaning southern Xinjiang, more obvious. The lack of interaction and exchange between different ethnic groups has caused the 3 factors of ethnicity, religion, and land to become superimposed, thereby strengthening the viewpoint that one ethnic group owns a particular land area, thereby weakening national identity and identification with the Chinese nation, adversely impacting peace and long-term stability. Consequently, controlling the growth rate of the ethnic minority population and adjusting the regional population structure are considered to be important ways to achieve long-term peace and stability in Xinjiang. She goes on to recommend stringent birth prevention measures, as do many others. Now, starting in 2017, Xinjiang implemented a range of new family planning mandates for counties. It specified that, for example, to quote from the Kucha County government, that family planning units are to formulate each county's mid- and long-term population development plan and annual plan. So there's annual plans and long-term population development plans. Be responsible for the macro control of the county's newborn population and manage the county's information system for women of childbearing age. Xinjiang by late 2018, had put in place everything it needed to forecast population growth and to manage it and to control it. Now, there's an intermediate level here. So we have a macro level of theory, but then we have people who have written, academics who have written, how do you actually do this? How do you, and what is the counterterrorism angle here? So population optimization has a very strong counterterrorism angle, and a lot of the arguments for why Xinjiang needs to adjust and change its ethnic population composition come from a perspective of national security. So it's not exactly very optional, yeah? It's a mandate for national security. A paper by 2 researchers from the Xinjiang Police Academy says, also 2017, says to completely eradicate terrorist crimes in Xinjiang, it's necessary to completely eradicate the soil, the growth conditions, and the environment in which mobs produce crimes. To do so, it's necessary to rationalize population structure and goes on economic measures, etc. So they go on to say, the same authors say, therefore, and they have a whole section on this, which I only quote one paragraph from. Therefore, optimizing the proportions of the population and improving and enhancing the quality of the population, which is to solve the human problem, is the foundation of solving Xinjiang's counterterrorism and other problems. Embedding the population is one of the simplest and most direct ways to solve the human problem. Embedding population means you need to have a minimum percentage of Han that you embed and intersperse with Uyghurs. This will achieve the goal of diluting the proportion of the proportion, and they go on to talk about problem populations. You want to dilute those problem populations, namely the poor population, unemployed population, low educated, of certain ethnic populations, and the proportion of the population with a criminal history. And they go on to say, you got to increase the proportion of the wealthy, the employed, and of certain ethnic groups, and we know which one that means. I have to be very brief. Unfortunately, I have to be quite sort of concise here. Oh yes, I never showed you this. Thank you, I didn't see you in time. Emily was trying to give me smoke signals, but the fire wasn't strong enough. Okay, Li Ming, a very interesting figure, has said a number of very interesting things. He's a counterterrorism researcher, and he writes about mixed Han-Uyghur villages, which is a whole other topic, and there's a little bit more in my research paper on this, and I'm quoting Joe. I'm also quoting Sam Tyman on that. Anyways, just a very brief thing here. He writes, for example, according to the village's cultural counterterrorism needs, and cultural counterterrorism is, of course, a whole research area, the scope of the population with positive energy in a village, which is Han, or better educated, or less religious people, should be expanded to 80 to 90% in a planned step-by-step and methodical manner. This is also, of course, about converting the Uyghurs. And the scope of the population with negative energy in a village should be reduced to 7% or less than 3%. This is a bit out of context. I'm just throwing this at you. My research paper has a lot more context to contextualize a statement like this, but just also this really links to the notion of the human problem. The Uyghur population problem, in sum, consists of a concern expressed by these people about the population size, the Uyghur population growth, and their concentration in one region. There we go. Now you can see it. But the Chinese state can't just dump millions of Han in southern Xinjiang. There's a problem of a limited carrying capacity. Increased per capita resource use has reduced the estimated ecological carrying capacity, especially in the rural south. We're talking a lack of arable land, a lack of water. And Chinese researchers have calculated this. They have quantified, in 2015, they estimated Xinjiang's rural overpopulation above the ecological carrying capacity of the land at nearly 2 million. In 2014, Khotan's total overpopulation was estimated at 670,000 among a total population of 2.3 million. And the researchers recommend stringent birth control measures. So all this put together, and I'm sorry, this is quite a bit of complex material in a fairly short amount of time, You can always ask more questions. I have tried now, after looking at intent, I have tried to also quantify, well, what could be the possible result. Now, I realize it's always going to be disputed if you try to quantify, if you put a number on something, like putting a number of how many people are in the camps. But there are, I think it's quite, I think academically it's fine to do this, and we all know that this is a projection of sorts. And I think we need to have some kind of an idea of like a range. What could the destruction in whole or in part look like? And the Han population share in southern Xinjiang, which was considered too low, is actually only 8.4%. If you look at the four provinces, the four southern provinces, the Han population share in Xinjiang was 34%, and the one praised by academics and officials as reasonable is 56%. In northern Xinjiang. My assumed minimum Han population share, if you want to embed even half of the Uyghur population at 50-50 or something like that, you want to achieve a decent Han population share. If 15% in the 5 prefectures was not enough, then I assume that 25% is like a minimum optimization goal. Of course, with the latest census data, we're getting some hint at just how much the Han population has already increased. I used, and I really don't have enough time to explain this, I used Chinese researchers' own population projection in southern Xinjiang if there was not a great deal of state interference, more or less at existing family planning regulations. Of course, now everybody can have 3 children officially, right? So it's now even more loose. And basically, if you are trying to achieve the 25% within a reasonable time frame, by 20 years, by 2040, and you don't want to massively increase the population, which would get you in trouble with the carrying capacity, you're looking at an ideal growth rate to maintain of just below negative. So you would slightly reduce. This would not be very noticeable. You could totally fool any visitor. There would not be a massively noticeable, visible population decline. The current ethnic population in southern Xinjiang now is 9.5 million. The projected, without draconian state interference, would be 13.1. Now, if you reduced population growth to minus 2.5, you would end up with a population by 2040 of 9 million, which is a loss. That's my time. See, I'm very good. With this, not with my presentation. But Ondřej is giving me a minute, so anyways. 2, thank you. I'll pay you back, man, with a beer in Prague. Okay, the destruction in part could be calculated or assessed as the difference between a projection without draconian state interference and with state interference, which would be 13. In this case, 13.1 minus 9 is 4.1. In my opinion, the most realistic range is between 3.1 and 4.1. But if you take a wider range, like between plus 5 per mil and minus 5 per mil population growth, it would range between 2.6 and 4.5 million, which is a title you saw on the Reuters headline. But at least, even if they were allowed to, you saw natural population growth in these counties had fallen to 1.66 per mil by 2019, yeah? So even if you had it at plus 2.5, which is a bit higher than that, you would have a loss destruction in part through systematic birth prevention over the next 20 years of 3.1 million. Okay? And if it was plus 5, it would be 2.6 million. So you could do it. That's how you do it. Conclusion. The evidence of intent, I would define tentatively as to optimize the population structure, and of course there's some inference here. This is inferred through the evidence I've presented. This is not directly stated by the state, and they would never state it directly like this, which is the problem, of course, of understanding intent. To optimize the population structure by increasing, the slides, thank you, I saw the smoke. To optimize the population structure by increasing the ratio of the Han population in relation to the ethnic minority population through an in-migration of Han, out-transfers of ethnic minorities, so labor transfers are already included, taken into account in the calculation, but they don't make a huge difference. And reducing ethnic minority birth rates, and the loss of life most likely a likely range based on meeting the criteria that are outlined between 3.1 and 4.1 million. Particularly troubling, one can take, regardless what one thinks of all this, one takes away the troubling framing of the Uyghur population as a human problem. Very concerning. And my time is up. Thank you very much.
Adrian, for that very sobering analysis, and without any delay, I'll pass it on to Ondřej. Ondřej, the floor is yours.
Hello? Yes. Good morning, everyone. Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful conference. Thank you to the organizers for organizing it. I will focus on the genocide, the potential genocidal intent to destroy, in whole, in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such by letter B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, as defined by the the Convention on the Prevention of Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. I was working on this aspect a little bit. Before I worked a lot, my work on this topic built on article by Joe Smith Finley, the introduction to the Central Asian Survey, the issue number 38, because I think this introduction is one of the most important, actually, articles in the entire argument. Joe was using Ruth Blakely's methodology or definition of state violence as state terrorism, which has 4 defining criteria, and Joe found that China's actions in Xinjiang do qualify in all 4 aspects as state terrorism. So I think this research means also that there is a clear intent to cause mental harm to Uyghurs as a group in Xinjiang. I was also looking at, or I think this question of intent to cause mental harm to Uyghurs also relates quite well to some slide, please. Yes, thank you. Relates quite well to some research in political science, namely some general definitions of totalitarian models of politics, of which many do contain reference to a systematic state terror practice or arbitrary use of violence by state organs. So, for example, the very classical totalitarian model by Karl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski, put forward in several articles, refers to a system of terroristic police control of the population as one of the defining features of a totalitarian regime. I was also very briefly, as I'm not a political scientist or a legal scholar, looking at Ernst Frankel's work or theory of the dual state, which was also referring to a Nazi system of government. He finds the unlimited arbitrariness and violence unchecked by any legal guarantees, a defining feature of so-called prerogative state in the Nazi government or system of government, as opposed to the normative state. Frankel specifically mentions that this context is a situation where the state and the party are increasingly becoming identical and intertwined. And the formally dual organization is preserved only for political and historical reasons. So I think that's a situation which very well relates to contemporary China and Xinjiang in specific. Slide, please. I think the Chinese government is trying to systematically cause mental harm to Uyghurs with a clear intent of doing so. A lot of things which we heard here so far at this conference, and we will hear more about, are specifically and systematically designed with the intent to intimidate Uyghurs, to cause mental harm, to traumatize them, to serve as deterioration of further actions which the government or the party state would regard as undesirable. So, for example, use of armed force against civilians during peaceful protests, besides the clear intent to kill the individuals, it's also served to deter population from similar demonstrations and protests. So are the extrajudicial killings and disappearances, very well documented, for example, in Gulja incidents, also in Urumqi incidents, in the Ilishku incidents of 2014. Another such feature would be, of course, the detention and prison system, which is integrated with forced labor and social re-engineering strategies, which are being implemented in Xinjiang, which are specifically designed, besides integrating the individuals into the system, also to deter and intimidate the remaining population, so-called outside the prisons. So is the system of surveillance, which is enabled by technology. Also the system of human surveillance, which is a classical method predating the technological progress and the use of technology for human monitoring. So are the ostentatious displays of power, such as military parades, the police constantly present in Uyghur neighborhoods wearing or carrying heavy military gear, etc. So is the campaign Fan Huitu, visit the people, benefit the people, bring together the hearts of the people, which is so well documented by Tim Gross and the Xinjiang Documentation Project. It clearly shows that the people are intimidated by the presence of the party workers in their very private spheres, and they are afraid of saying things or acting in a certain way. There have been several exemplarily harsh sentences on trumped-up charges, such as the life sentence for Ilham Tohti or the death sentences for Tashpola Taib, Sattar Sawood, Halmurad Gopur, who are intellectuals. So are the confession videos, which is a practice of Maoist period, which has been resurrected in the Xi Jinping period. It applies not only in Xinjiang, but also in inner Chinese political affairs. Confession videos, except for subjugating the particular person into confession, the public aspect is designed to intimidate and make an exemplary case to the general population, see how you can end up disgraced and publicly humiliated if you don't stay within the lines. So these are just several examples from how the party state has been trying to intimidate and systematically cause mental harm to Uyghur population inside Xinjiang. Slide, please. Same situation applies to Uyghurs overseas. Chinese party state, even before the Xi Jinping period, has been approaching the Uyghur diaspora outside as one of the top security risks, so-called 5 poisons. Research on that has been very well done by James Tuo, especially monograph published, the Qiao extraterritorial policies for the overseas Chinese. So East Turkestan campaigners, Falun Gong, Tibet, Taiwan, and pro-democracy activists are regarded so-called 5 poisons, which are the top 5 security threats to the political stability of the regime. The problem is that China is targeting the entire Uyghur diaspora, regardless of the level of their religious activization or radicalization or even political activism. So there is a systematic whole bulk of research done by the Uyghur Human Rights Project, by the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs recently, which maintains a database of the incidents of transnational repression. China has been applying also the so-called 3 warfares doctrine, which is a doctrine. It's not a doctrine of warfare. It's a doctrine of enhancing political security of the regime, because the PLA is not an army, it's an armed wing of the party. So specifically, China has been employing all three kinds of the warfare. So there is psychological warfare, public debate warfare, and legal warfare to Uyghur diaspora. Slide, please. So in my field research within the Uyghur diaspora since 2012, until last time 2019, which I published in several articles, I found numerous instances of these systematic pressures on Uyghur diaspora. I think many of them have been mentioned here or are known in quite well detailed. The Uyghur diaspora is traumatized already by itself, even without the Chinese pressure, by trauma of that they have left their community and family behind in a very critical situations in the homeland. Many times, especially in Turkey, a lot of people don't have documents. That means they don't have access to legal work, so they don't have money, they don't have healthcare, education, etc. They're in dire need of psychological counseling, I found. China is able to use their dire situation very well in order to exert further pressure to cause mental harm on the community by human resources, so human surveillance, by technological means, so direct contacting via WEPO by local public security officials in Xinjiang, character assassination campaigns on social media such as Facebook, Twitter, also spreading rumors about particular individuals by human resource means. Even Uyghurs living outside abroad who are not in any way politically active do often have to provide a lot of information to local police in Xinjiang, who is asking them, where are you living? Please send us the document, your address, what do you do, who you talk to, what do you talk to about. There are specific techniques that the Chinese party state is using to pressure and to coerce Uyghur diaspora into stopping their political activism when they are not politically active, to return home, to get specific information about Uyghur diaspora's activities, or to spy systematically for the party state. Many people are contacted by police directly. I have heard a case when a man in Turkey campaigned on behalf of his disappeared relatives. Very shortly after, the police from Xinjiang sent him a picture of his relative, saying, hey, we have him, look. Another case that I heard was that a person got called from his house in Xinjiang by his landline number. So he, of course, answered, but there was a policeman visiting his family at the time. So it's a very, very clearly, very, I would say, niftily designed tactic with the use of the landline to make the person to answer the phone call, so that it's not an unknown number, and also to show him, hey, we are in your house and we have your family members. So, and these are not very isolated cases. Of course, not all the information can be verified, but there are many cases of such instances which have very similar traits, and they altogether do clearly constitute the intent to cause mental harm to Uyghur diaspora abroad. There are also instances of legal warfare, namely extradition requests or Interpol red notices. In Kazakhstan, for example, Uyghur diaspora members have related that they have to, when they want to leave Xinjiang to Kazakhstan, they have to state or leave several relatives back home as a kind of deposit, so 1-to-3 ratio, etc. There is a lot of other information. So these findings, I think, clearly bring several types of debates to another level, and I think we should have the debate. I think, namely, it refers, or it implies that the debate about the totalitarian model of the PRC's political system should be revisited, at least because a lot of the arguments, for example, by the mentioned references. They say that, for example, a system of terroristic police control has not been a normal feature in political life in the major communist states since at least early 1950s. This is a book from 1990, which clearly is not the case today in Xinjiang. So we should have this debate again. Or Juan Lintz famously says that a post-totalitarian regime roots out the cruelest repression mechanisms. China generally in the political science debate is regarded as an authoritarian regime, but clearly Xinjiang is a place where all of the classic features of totalitarian politics apply, including use of terror, arbitrary violence with the clear intent to cause mental harm to the population. Same thing, I think, applies to the debate about genocide. I do agree that what is happening now today in Xinjiang is a whole another angle at looking at genocide. But I think we should continue having this debate, even though it means that we should revisit, reevaluate views on other similar practices in the other countries. I do strongly believe that when we say A, we should also say B, but I think we should not refrain from saying A so that we don't have to say B. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ondřej. And without any delay at all, I'll pass it on to Elise.
Test. Can you hear me now? Perfect. Okay. So I am going to talk to you on the topic of the question of intent in the Uyghur genocide. So over the past year, the tides have turned in how members of the international community have begun characterizing the rights abuses of the party state against Uyghurs in the Uyghur Autonomous Region, or Uyghur region. As governments have begun holding parliamentary inquiries and taking action to address this crisis, scholars, analysts, observers have debated whether China's actions truly rise to the level of genocide. And perhaps unsurprisingly, arguments against genocide designation have emerged and have been largely centered on 2 points, characterizing in broad strokes here. One is that literal understandings of genocide mean, sort of an etymological analysis means that we have to understand genocide as mass slaughter. And a second argument that's been leveled is that claims of evidence of Chinese government or party state intent are insufficient to declare that genocide is occurring. So I work at the Uyghur Human Rights Project, a Washington, D.C.-based NGO conducting research-based advocacy in defense of human rights for Uyghurs and others, documenting rights abuses over the decades. At UHRP, we are firmly of the belief that the Chinese party state is perpetrating genocide against Uyghurs, that the party state is attempting to destroy key elements of Uyghur life and lifeways, and to eradicate Uyghurs as a group. We are also deeply concerned that debates over terminology often fail to consider the full range of evidence regarding intent, or that we could use to make an argument about intent, and that even more alarmingly, these debates are eclipsing the imperative to act. So I am perhaps obviously not Uyghur myself, but I have been entrusted as a representative of a Uyghur-run organization to share a Uyghur view of this situation with you. Uyghurs have watched their already very minimal rights disappear over the past few decades and over the last few years, right? To many Uyghurs, if not all Uyghurs around the world, evidence of intent to destroy them as a group is abundant, and the goal of this campaign of repression seems very clear. It looks like permanent eradication to many Uyghurs. But this repression that we're seeing doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? The contours of the processes that are in play now have been in play for a number of decades, but maybe bear just a little bit of repeating here. and with a number of key kind of inflection points, or smaller inflection points, right? So you can look at the 1990s and what happened with the Baron Uprising in 1991, the Rojava massacre in 1997. That was the start of a pattern that Gardner Bovingdon identified, whereby any Uyghur expressions of discontent were met by, increasingly hardline state reactions to that, right? Showing Uyghurs that they had no space for a civil society, right? Into the 2000s, there was, the United States listing of the ETIM as a, quote, terrorist organization, China's formal entrance into the global war on terror, education, developments in education policy and so-called bilingual, but really monolingual education policy, the events of 2009 in Urumqi and the violent state response afterward. In 2014, the declaration of the People's War on Terror, coterminous with a Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism. By that summer of 2014, there was the institution of the Bianmin Ka, or the People's Convenient Card, which essentially became a tool of apartheid, whereby Uyghurs were rendered second-class citizens who did not have the right to move around different jurisdictions or municipalities in their own home region. Over 2015 and 16, there was the buildup of the surveillance state. I was living in the region at the time, along with some people in this room, seeing some of these things happen. And then, of course, the biggest inflection point, I think, of all, 2016, the appointment of Chen Quanguo as party secretary of the region, and the massive shifts in policy and implementation and practice, right, that occurred afterward. If you visit UHRP's website, uhrp.org, and look at our research catalog back through the, not just the past few years, but the decades, you can see that we have been documenting rights abuses against Uyghurs for almost 2 decades. Right? And it's only now, over the past few years, that people have really started to listen. And it's because of this, what I keep calling this inflection point. I'll just repeat myself a little bit. But there are obvious, continuities between, as I'm saying, right, between this campaign, between the decades that preceded it. But there are also, new trends, new alarming technologies, and some new processes in play. And there's this shift in intensity and the confluence of everything that is happening now, everything that is at play now, which poses, a very real existential threat to Uyghurs, and is the basis of so much suffering and so much fear that we see among Uyghurs in the diaspora, and that I saw among Uyghurs when I was last in the region in 2018. Yesterday, we heard Aaron Rosenberg, talk about elements of cultural destruction as really central to how genocide was conceived of, right, and how the convention was written in its sort of initial framing. And it is elements of cultural destruction that sounded some of the earliest alarm bells for Uyghurs. The state has been very hard at work to erase local lifeways, and then also replace them with something else, right? It's not enough just to erase them. There are actual acts of replacement happening as well. That's happened really famously. Everyone always quotes that break their lineage line, right? But we've also seen this happen in language, in statements by Uyghur government officials themselves saying Uyghurs are not Turks, rewriting history, really doubling down on the line that Xinjiang has always been an inseparable part of China since time immemorial, right? The State Council did that again in August 2019. Just last week, the party in Kashgar reissued guidelines about the modernization of the home space, reminding women that they're supposed to watch what they wear and not wear tunics that are too long and not cover their head in any way, right? Intrusion down to every level of daily life. These things alone, devoid of any broader context, I think should be very, very alarming to us as very serious violations of rights. But they're also occurring against a backdrop of so many other awful violations happening at the same time, We've been documenting at UHRP over the last couple of years, transnational repression on a massive scale. You just heard Ondřej talking about this. The crisis of Uyghur statelessness as well, brought on by the refusal of the Chinese government to reissue documents to Uyghurs who are abroad. Intimidation through proof of life videos, which you heard Emily Epson talking about yesterday. A leaked document we published on the Karakash list alongside Adrian. The targeting of the Uyghur elite, religious elite, intellectual elite. We have some forthcoming research on the business elite also as special targets, right? And then the even broader backdrop is everything we know about internment in what are concentration camps, mass incarceration in prison through the criminal legal system, family separation, forced sterilization, population control, forced labor, human surveillance, technological surveillance. It goes on and on. And the confluence of all of these things together is what convinces, right, an organization like UHRP and Uyghurs who have been sounding the alarm bells for decades that there is an intent to destroy at play here. And so I want to just wrap up by kind of raising a few questions. Putting aside the excellent point Sophie Richardson made earlier that crimes against humanity are no less bad than genocide, which I think is a very important intervention we should all keep in mind. I would ask, as we talk about whether this is genocide, what do we call it? Are we collectively waiting for a representative of the Chinese party state to stand up and say, okay, yeah, we intend to commit genocide? Because sometimes it feels like that's what we're waiting for, and we're never going to get that. Is a genocide only a genocide once it's already complete? That's another question, because if that's the case, then what are we doing? And it's too late, right? What good is a Convention on Genocide Prevention, which is what this convention we keep talking about is, if we're not going to use that convention and what it spells out in order to call out processes that are clearly affecting forms of destruction and loss and look from the outside as though they are intent on destruction? And when, collectively, are we going to act? I actually will end by doing one more thing, which is reading to you a letter to the editor by UHRP Executive Director Ömer Kanat. And this was published in The Economist in February of this year in response to the editorial that appeared there. So, Ömer Kanat writes, "A slow-motion genocide is still a genocide. The drafters of the UN Convention added the clauses you mention of preventing births and so on in anticipation of subtler means of destroying a group without systematic killing. The Uyghurs case and cases in the future will undoubtedly adhere to this more subtle form of eradicating a people. The world faces existential challenges like climate change that will require action from China, but the last thing we should do is downplay its abuses. Call it whatever you want: human rights abuse, atrocities, crimes against humanity, or genocide. If history has taught us one thing, it is that the world is slow to act to horrors like this one, in part because we allowed the debate about labels to eclipse the debate about what must be done to stop it." Thank you.
Thank you, Elise, for that sobering ending. Sean, I'll pass it on to you, and I'm not sure if you can, how well you can hear me, but if you could possibly use a timer as well. And we've got 15 minutes, so the floor is yours, Sean.
the physical extermination of a group, but it is of the destruction of a national or ethnic group. And I see obvious parallels with other. Oh, and I'm getting a message that I can't be heard on the live stream. So I don't know if that's an issue. Can I be heard in the room? All right. So what I do want to note is that I think this understanding of genocide as it relates to indigenous peoples is not an outlier in the discourse as suggested yesterday by Rune. I think that it is really something that has been discussed for decades by the indigenous peoples movement globally. And I think it's been won in terms of the way that scholars have acknowledged the genocide of Native Americans, Australasian indigenous peoples, and so on. Now, in terms of intentions of states, I also want to make a brief kind of disclaimer. I think that one should not anthropomorphize states. It can be difficult to determine the intentions of an institution as amorphous as a state. And I think it's also important to understand that states' stated intentions frequently involve platitudes that do not represent actual intentions, but are intended to engage globalized discourses. However, I want to focus in particular in my presentation on state actions as being instructive in identifying intentions, especially when these actions appear coordinated towards accomplishing a goal. Now, if we talk about China's stated intentions in the Uyghur region, they kind of alternate between combating an existential terrorist threat fueled by Islamic extremism and alleviating poverty. I think these are both platitudes that link to globalized discourses. And I also feel that both of these discourses are suggestive of remediation with the state as the agent to establish that remediation, whether that be de-radicalization or development. So like modernization, they're both social Darwinian concepts suggesting that the state must change people for their own good. Now, if we look at what China is doing in the Uyghur region in the name of counterterrorism, de-radicalization, and poverty alleviation, I think we can see a systematic complex of policies that appear coordinated to accomplish a specific goal, which I think is settler colonization of the region. And to do so, the state must destroy its indigenous peoples, at least as a group consciousness. So this involves completely breaking their collective solidarity and social capital, severing their connection to the territory, severing the people's connection to religion, the use of coercion to subject people to assimilation measures culturally and linguistically, depopulating Uyghur and Kazakh majority territories through displacement and birth control, which have been discussed today, economically, socially, and politically marginalize them, transform the territory into a generic part of China with little remnants of indigenous legacy except for tourism purposes, and gradually increase Han in-migration, which I think is the one area that has been somewhat neglected thus far, and I think that it's important for scholars to be watching that process, because it seems to fit the logic of this general complex of policies. So I'm just going to quickly go through how we see these policies in practice. Mass surveillance and mass incarceration, which have been kind of at the center of this crisis since 2017, if not earlier. And I believe that these are kind of the cornerstone of this complex of policies. They serve to break down social capital because, as Ondřej just mentioned that creates this overwhelming sense of fear among the population, inability to trust each other, and also mentioned by both Ondřej and Elise. It's also served to essentially remove the cultural producers of the community. And I think that this is why this aspect of what's happening is so important. But I do think that it's the other policies that are really working to denigrate and erase the indigenous culture of the region. We have lots of different policies focused on coerced assimilation, the fear of incarceration, and the acknowledgement of constant surveillance makes any compliance with these policies very much one of coercion. And this includes, of course, residential schools, which harks back to the experience of other indigenous peoples. But as Tim Gross yesterday outlined, it also includes lots of other policies that are related to the campaign of 3 News and also the cadre visitation program, and just village life more generally. Of course, transforming the territory, and as Nathan yesterday discussed, I think in many ways Mazars are the most emblematic aspect of this, because these sites have incredibly important resonance with the Uyghur identity, and in particular that identity's attachment to the land. But there's, of course, many other things happening and transforming the landscape of this region and erasing the legacy of indigenous peoples and indigenous culture. That includes the destruction or closing of mosques. It includes the destruction of traditional villages and the replacement of those with new structures. It includes also kind of the touristification of various aspects of Uyghur life. I think the coerced industrial work programs, which are largely residential, are a key component of this complex of policies, because it both displaces the indigenous population from their communities and puts them in a Han linguistic and cultural milieu. And in many cases, it's been documented very well that these programs are bringing Uyghurs and other native peoples of the regions outside of the region, and at the very least, removing them from their native villages. And then finally, the reduction of their demographic footprint of the indigenous population is I think, critical, as Adrian mentioned earlier in this panel, and as James Liebold talked about yesterday. I think this really gets to the crux of the issue. As Adrian mentioned, it's framing the national security issue, the issue of poverty alleviation around the human problem of ethnic minority population. So although I said I don't really have the expertise to comment on international law, I thought it was very interesting yesterday, the discussion that we have to pay attention to motives and intentions. But I would also include in there justifications or rationalizations. So I think very much what we see in the Uyghur region in terms of the PRC's motives for its action is a desire to colonize this area and settle it and make it more a generic part of the People's Republic of China. To do so, I do believe the intent of the state is to destroy the indigenous peoples as we know them, reduce their demographic footprint, destroy their culture, language, and spirituality, sever their connection to land, and marginalize those who remain. Now, the justification or rationalization, of course, is counterterrorism and poverty alleviation. both of which are suggestive of the need for the state to transform Uyghurs and related peoples for their own good. And just in conclusion, I would like to note that both of these discourses also tend to dehumanize the indigenous population, which of course is a critical part of allowing for their erasure. And I have been doing some work looking at how these different discourses are very much 21st century representations of the idea of the civilizing mission of European colonial regimes in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I think it serves very much the same purpose by suggesting that the people must be changed for their own good and to forcibly subject them to that transformation. So I'm going to leave my comments to that, and I'll be open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sean. Before we open up to questions, I'll take a few questions at once so we can get them over and done with. We don't have a lot of time. But Adrian, I want to point out that I really appreciated your utilization of hard data to demonstrate intent, but at the same time using some of the quotes from senior party officials, Li Yulei, to also demonstrate that this actually marries very carefully and very succinctly with the actual intent of the party. Ondřej, you mentioned how the dual state party structure, this raises very important legal implications in terms of holding a state accountable if it cannot be distinguished from the party itself, and also how targeting Uyghurs overseas goes well beyond the counter-terrorism narrative that they're trying to portray. Elise, the confluence of multiple actions clearly demonstrates the intent of the party. This cannot be disputed. And I think your point about whether this argument of genocide is an academic exercise, and unfortunately many of us fall into that. We get into these debates and we forget that the purpose of the 1948 Genocide Convention is to actually not just prevent genocide, but to actually punish it. So why are states reluctant to portray this genocide, come to this genocide determination? Because it essentially forced them to do something. And if you remember the famous memo that has been declassified that Samantha Power mentions during the Rwanda genocide, when it said, be careful, legal at state trying to classify this as a genocide will force us to do something. Because once a state designates a situation as a genocide, they are under obligation under the 1948 Genocide Convention to intervene and do something, and otherwise they themselves will be in breach of the Genocide Convention. Hence, when there is no political will to get involved, as would more likely be the case with a superpower like China, then that intent, that political will is not there. Sean, I really appreciate how you put together the anthropological perspective and using Lemkin's original definition, and how you mentioned how we need to pay attention to not just the motives and intention, but also the justification and the realization, the rationalization of the policy of the Chinese Communist Party. And with that, I'll open it up to the floor. I'll take a few questions at a time. So I'll take a few at a time. The gentleman at the front here. If you want to also mention if there's a particular speaker you want to address it to.
Okay, is this working? All right. So this is for Dr. ZENZ, but anybody else who can answer it. I'm intrigued by the phrase like rationalizing the population structures. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on whether the rationalization in this phrase is referring to the constituents of the population, whether it's some sort of concept of civilization of the population itself, or somehow making when it says rationalization of the population structures, is it talking about the constituents of the population itself, or the general shape of the population? I guess the social forms of the population.
Okay. We take another couple.
there we go. So this one is also directed to Dr. ZENZ. And somebody asks, are there any studies on population pyramids or death rates in Xinjiang? And what could this give to our understanding of genocidal intent?
Yep, the young gentleman with the glasses.
It's very nice of you to describe me as young. I appreciate that. Yes, my question really was about transnational repression and its use by Ondřej, which I thought was really helpful, and also the comparative perspective to other sort of post-communist regimes. So we can do comparative work on transnational repression because we've got databases of the Central Asian republics I've been involved with and the ones on Uyghurs, which Uyghur Human Rights Project and Oxus have put together. And it seems to me that might be quite helpful in addressing this question of whether something specifically genocidal is going on here, because in the political exiles work we've done on places like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, it is limited largely to a kind of political exile. Some of the people get wrapped up in that, human rights activists, academics, but it's a relatively small group of persons that are subject to this coercion by proxy that you describe very well, and some of the more extreme measures of renditions and disappearances. So it might, my question is simply, is there something in the data we see on Uyghurs where there's something a bit more systematic being applied across the whole diaspora, where really, we can say the incidence level is high in a large number of people, and even for those who are keeping their heads down and not involved publicly, they're also subject to this, because if that's the case, that's qualitatively different to what we've seen, I think, in the Central Asian republics across the mountains.
Thank you so much. So, Dr. questions for you on the rationalization, whether it refers to the constituents or the civilizational aspect and the social construct, and also if there's any studies on the pyramids or any population pyramids in Xinjiang.
Yes. So on rationalizing the population, this discourse basically says that the extremely high percentage of ethnic minorities concentrated in southern Xinjiang is irrational or unreasonable compared to northern Xinjiang, where you have a 56% Han share, and then so it's more like 50-50. That's then considered more reasonable or rational. So this is, of course, completely arbitrary definition of rationality, because historically the population of Xinjiang, of course, or of this area, has always been dominated by ethnic minorities, notably Uyghurs, especially in the heartland. But I think this discourse is trying to counter the notion that southern Xinjiang that there is actually such a thing as a Uyghur heartland, because it's all China, right? To the second question, death rates in Xinjiang and their development are kind of all over the place. Death rates can be a somewhat funny figure. Some have increased, some have decreased. Death rates conceivably can decrease if there is either better healthcare or less movement, less accidents, or if you have a reduction of births, then you would have also fewer stillbirths, fewer health issues with the newborn population, or possibly pregnant, doing less complications during pregnancy. So this could lead to a slightly lower death rate, but again, this is all over the place. It would be interesting to look at it very systematically, see if one can find a trend. But as far as I can tell, there's not a really clear trend in death rates indicating intent.
Thank you. And Ondřej, on transnational persecution, political exiles and rendition.
I think I haven't worked too much on Central Asia, but I find the efforts in Turkey quite systematic, and I would be interested to what level they are comparable to, for example, tactics in the Central Asian republics, because the political climate is very different. The things that Chinese organs are able to do in Central Asia, they cannot do in Turkey so openly, for example. My actually related to question to this aspect for our legal lawyer colleagues is that China persecutable on charges of genocide due to committing these acts of psychological pressure on diaspora in other countries, because these are crimes that are happening outside of China, many times in countries where which do subscribe to the Genocide Convention and related legislature.
We have a couple of lawyers. Any of them want to address that? Is China prosecutable, considering its transnational renditions? Does anyone want to tackle that? John, Professor John Packer. Can we get a microphone to him?
Well, I think this is actually a kind of really fundamental point. So in international law, a state as such is not prosecutable. Prosecution is a criminal action, and a state as such, determined by the International Law Commission, which is established by the UN Charter, and its report of 2000, adopted by United Nations member states, including, by the way, China, USA, many others, actually says that a state as such cannot commit a crime. I know that's the Genocide Convention says crimes, but a state as such. And there's a rationale I can explain to you later why a state cannot be, because there's no supranationality, in short, okay? Sovereign equality, states are sovereign equally. So if the question is, can a state be subject to a legal process before other jurisdictions, the answer is yes. And so but I think what you're trying to touch upon here is that can individuals be prosecuted, and that is yes, and that is under, for example, the principle of universal jurisdiction. But usually, and in international law, you can't do that in absentia. You got to find a person, you have to indict them, you have to proceed against a real existing person. Not the easiest thing to do in the case of China, but a state cannot be prosecuted.
Being arrested in a foreign country and being extradited seems quite slim. Yeah, but Elise, go ahead.
To go back to this question on transnational repression, right? Like Ondřej, I myself can't make deeply informed comparisons to Central Asia, but my sense, based on your comments just now, is that yes, there's something much more systematic being applied across the entire diaspora to Uyghurs. So this transnational repression report, No Space Left to Run, that we published with Oxus at UHRP it looks at 15 cases of only stage 2 and stage 3 transnational repression from 1997 into 2021. So that's people who, for those who don't know, right, detentions or renditions, stage 2 and stage 3. We couldn't even consider stage 1 because the evidence that we are still gathering from Uyghurs suggests that virtually everyone is subject to intimidation and pressure on that stage 1 level. And it would be nearly impossible to do the kind of exhaustive research we would have wanted to do on that. And to your question of, is that the case even for those people who are not involved publicly in activism? Absolutely, and this is one of the ways that China ensures that people are not publicly involved in any sort of advocacy for the Uyghur cause.
Thanks a lot. Well, first I just want to chip into the discussion before, because I've been working in the Uyghur diaspora in Turkey and in Scandinavia and Germany quite a lot. I also think there's a very systematic pressure put on the Uyghur diaspora, but I think it's very much the people who have come out more recently, so people who've come out since 2012, 2013, that are targeted mostly. And very often people are targeted through their families at home rather than directly. So I think that may be also a difference to the Central Asian cases. I want to say thank you to Ondřej for mentioning if you say A, you should also say B, and I think that's a very important point. I've been talking to some people here at the conference who say that if we apply the Lemkin idea of genocide, or the Lemkin definition of genocide, will probably have between 30 and 50 cases that would need to be reconsidered as genocide, and I think that's a very good case. I'm also glad that Sean mentions Australia and the Americas, and I would like to ask the panel if they could comment on that sort of basically a consistent application of the definition that we choose. I would like to then move on to Elise and ask her, because you talk about the imperative to act and that something should be done. What you think should be done? What is the plan going forward? Say this gets recognized as a genocide by a lot of different sides. So far, the US has recognized it as a genocide. It's only the 7th time in the US history that it does so. I haven't seen that it has acted yet. I'm asking, why is that not the case, and what would you think the US should be doing now? But also, what should we all be doing to move forward with that? Just very shortly, and then I'll stop. I do think, Adrian, that your methodology of taking one projection of natural growth and comparing it to another projection of less growth, if measures were implemented that are not being stated, but that you see as the only way to implement recommendations by some scholars to reach an optimal sort of state, is quite problematic because it's very, very speculative. And because, as you said yourself, the connection between these scholars' ideas of an optimal state and the measures that a government is ready to take to get to that optimal state, or even if the government recognizes that as the optimal state, is not really proven. And I would like to ask you to figure in the urban-rural divide distinction in this, because you talk about an overpopulation in rural southern Xinjiang, but urbanization could also be a measure of changing that. And so if you can take that distinction between rural population and urban population into your argument. Thank you.
Do we have another few? Yeah, we'll take one more. Take one more from the young lady here. If you just ask and I'll repeat your question. If you just ask your question, I'll repeat it.
Yes, it was more like a remark, but also a question for Ondřej. You spoke of the consequences of this intent of mental harm and shame, guilt, scars from the torture and harassment. But I'm wondering myself, and this is a question for all of us, I mean, maybe to this intent to describe the mental harm as a kind of a part of the intention of genocide, maybe it should be really interesting to describe very precisely how to articulate the layer of deprivation, what you described within the diaspora, people not accessing counseling, not accessing so many things. And also, beside the layer of deprivation, there is a layer for me as a psychoanalyst of paranoia and melancholia. And in our field, there is a very, very precise articulation in between deprivation, paranoia, and melancholia. And maybe it would be really interesting to go through that to describe more precisely the intent of mental harm.
Thank you so much. Trauma.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. Yes, I agree. Okay, I agree. So,
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so let me take the first question. I'll take it to Sean. Sean, if you can just give 30 seconds. The application of this definition that you've articulated, the anthropological perspective and the Lemkin definition, should that be applied across the board to all other cases?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe it should be. I think that, you know, a part of the answer to Rune's question, unfortunately, is it's my impression that we've not seen any sort of accountability for genocide ever until after the fact. And so in that context, I think, yes, we have seen, increasing recognition that the fate of Native Americans has been genocidal. The fate of indigenous people around the world has been genocidal. I think that it's an important issue to advocate on more generally, and there's been people advocating on it for decades. And so I don't see any contradiction in terms of recognizing this case. I think that, it's a whole other issue when we talk about the geopolitics of this. And I think that, it's important to divorce the geopolitics of the situation from what we're talking about as scholars. I think that, the idea that it's critical that a Uyghur expert also criticize another state's actions when they're not experts on it is actually somewhat problematic. I think I have personal opinions about what the Israeli state is doing to Palestinians, but I don't have the expertise to comment on that. And I would think an expert in the Palestinian people would not want me commenting on that, as I would not want necessarily an expert on Palestine to talk about the fate of the Uyghurs without the expertise to do so.
So Elise, very quickly, 20 seconds, what should be done? What does it actually mean, these genocide determinations? You're 15 seconds now, actually, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Taking 5 seconds away from me. I mean, we've already seen some modest action through things like sanctions regimes, which, while they can be somewhat limited in what they actually do, the response we've seen from the party state to them, I think, means that they work in their own way. I think further government action, coordination between governments on things like, sanctions and withhold release orders along the lines of what the United States has been doing, pressure on business, pressure when it comes to labor. We've seen these things working to an extent, and so greater coordination between governments on those levels is necessary.
Ondřej, go ahead.
Yes, if I may comment on this also, I think pressure over selling technological goods such as Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, Tahua, this kind of merchandise works really well.
Adrian, final to you. Literally seconds, wrap it up, but your approach is problematic and it's far too speculative.
I'll respond in 5 seconds to the comment that my approach is problematic. No problem. Good, I'll try to be very brief. A careful reading of my full paper, and to some extent the preprint, which is slightly more detailed. You always have to cut words in the final version. I think will actually deal with quite a few of the points raised. In terms of the population projection, I do cite at least one alternative study projection in order to give one alternative to the baseline projection that could be made. And the difference is not drastic. But of course, I agree, projections are projections, but there are also further projections one can find. The basic methodology, the approach of taking a baseline less interference or ongoing population projection and compare that to population scenarios that would meet certain criteria of the state. And of course, I give quite a range from +5 to -5 per mil. That's a huge range. The basic methodology and the approach of doing so for a quantitative assessment of the possible range of destruction was declared as a sound methodology by over 12 experts interviewed by Reuters. And they don't say this in the article, but I know that they spoke to legal experts, demographers, experts on population, experts on different disciplines. And the paper went through peer review by 4 scholars, one of them with a particular quantitative focus. The question of the rural versus urban is very valid. That's entirely valid. Now, in my presentation, I only quote one overpopulation number, which happened to be rural, because I thought it was particularly pertinent. However, in the full paper, and possibly even more so in the preprint, I quote multiple overpopulation calculations, which are not specific to rural, but include urban. So, and I give one particular case from Aksu by the China Institute of Water Resources and Hydropower Research on water resource utilization in Aksu, which particularly brings out the problem that actually if you urbanize and if you build up an industry, such as a textile industry, the water usage actually goes up as well. So with urbanization, you can actually increase the resource usage footprint rather than decreasing it, which exacerbates the problem. But this is just a brief response, and I'll have to stop here.
Thank you so much.
But thank you for your comments, and I always welcome criticism.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time now. We're over time. A round of applause for our stellar panelists here.
Okay, thank you very much to panel 7 speakers. Just to pick up on something Ondřej mentioned, this special issue in Central Asian Survey entitled Securitization, Insecurity and Conflict in Contemporary Xinjiang. This contains several papers by speakers here at this conference today, myself, Rachel Harris, Adrian ZENZ, and also by some other scholars in our field. Very important publication on the current crisis. These are free. There's a pile of them on the table over there. Grab one if you would like one after this. And it's now my very great pleasure to introduce to you our first keynote speaker, who is Schona JOLLY QC, who is chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales. And Schona is going to talk to us on the topic genocide, crimes against humanity, and the responsibility of states to Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang. Can international law step in where diplomacy stands still? Schona.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Well, first of all, I am... Are you sure? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. So the title of my talk this morning is Genocide, Crimes Against Humanity, and the Responsibility of States to Uyghurs and Other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, China, asking, can international law step in where diplomacy stands still? First, I'm honored to be invited here to do this keynote speech today, speaking to and with so many names and faces I recognize after 18 months of working behind a screen. Thank you very much to Jo and Hannah and her team for organizing this conference in the very hardest of times and bringing together so many voices that wish to speak out about the grave situation ongoing in Xinjiang today. I wish also to make clear that everything I say today is in my own capacity alone and attributable only to me. Also, before I move to the substance of my talk this morning, I do wish to acknowledge another situation unfolding on the ground, even as we all sit and stand here, where international law, politics, and reality collide with frightening circumstances. For our friends, colleagues, and so many others in Afghanistan right now, these are terrifying times. The promise of law, be that the rule of law, international law, of accountability, of equality, right now has failed in Afghanistan in every way. the lawyers, judges, activists, and human rights defenders currently in Afghanistan and their families face fatal threats because of their involvement in that promise of law. For those of us on the outside trying to help them leave to reach safety, trying to convince our own governments at home to help them to leave, to get them to safety, we must also convince those in power that the promise of law was a real promise made by our governments. Such promises must be kept so that the promise of law, of its stability, of its equal application, of justice and accountability, and of its protection for all, is not relegated to mere rhetoric and history. And with both that promise of law and the commitment to ensure it is not relegated to mere rhetoric, I wish then to turn to the question of alleged atrocity crimes in Xinjiang. Can international law step in where diplomacy stands still? I want also just to say that most of you, I think, in this room are academics, and I, of course, come at this from a legal perspective. I come at it from the perspective of a lawyer, which is very often a practical perspective, and so I leave much of the very interesting detail and the academic debate on research, on figures, to those better qualified in this room. The severe ill-treatment, repression and abuse of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims by the Chinese state has been widely reported in open source material. Independent investigations within Xinjiang have been notoriously difficult, and entry remains strictly guarded and monitored. Notwithstanding that secrecy, serious allegations, some of which we've heard about this morning and yesterday, have emanated from a number of diverse and credible sources. The primary sources upon which I base any assessment of that evidence comes, first of all, from first-hand accounts from individuals with direct experience of the situation or through their family members. Secondly, covertly obtained audiovisual evidence through in-depth journalistic investigations. And thirdly, the leaking of official documents, including the so-called China cables. These are all in the public domain and have been studied carefully, verified, and indeed remain being debated by experts even here. It is that information which forms the basis of the documented allegations which, if proven, would constitute very serious violations of international human rights and international criminal law. Unlike many or most situations in which atrocity crimes are alleged to have been committed, this situation is not taking place in the context of war, but rather in a stable and functioning state which has a powerful economic reach around the world, diplomatic relations with the international community, and has been narrowly, very narrowly, re-elected in the UN Human Rights Council. Indeed, it has used that seat to make, and I quote, derogatory and inflammatory remarks against UN special rapporteurs that have criticized its actions in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, and Tibet, and has threatened both the UN system and its officers from the power of that seat. It is in that disturbing context in which all and any form of accountability is being evaded, and in which the political and diplomatic communities appear to have become unstuck. How do you deal with a problem like this in the context of a state with the political and economic power, influence, and reach of China, and which to all intents and purposes appears to have slipped away from the enforcement mechanisms of international law, and is actively pursuing a policy by which any dissent on the international stage, and indeed even within our domestic forums, will or may not be tolerated? It is a very serious challenge at multiple levels, to which we must acknowledge there are no simple solutions. Diplomacy has struggled with the conflicting interests, and the consequences, not only does accountability feel distant, but the prospect of putting an end to immediate pain and suffering in Xinjiang, which must be the urgent task of the international community, remains remote. It is important, too, that we pause to recognize that the situation in Xinjiang, in which atrocity crimes are alleged, arise in the context of a world in which commitment to international human rights amongst individual states is weak. The international and political framework which has been built and which was built to support human rights is reliant on the commitment of states, and itself is at a low ebb. China has a permanent seat on the Security Council and will use its veto to effect. It is now seeking to shape and reframe the UN agenda with seats on the Human Rights Council and other leadership positions. Special rapporteurs have been singular and united in their attempts to bring focus on what is happening in Xinjiang and indeed in Tibet and Hong Kong. The high point being a letter signed by 50 of them last June, in which they called for decisive measures and renewed attention on what was happening in all of those places. Specific measures were identified, including the establishment of an impartial and independent mechanism to monitor, analyse and report on violations. But China, now sitting on the Human Rights Council, has every interest in obstructing this call, and it is difficult to see what, if any, progress has been made by the Secretary-General to this end. Following reports that the UN earlier this year that the UN was seeking a no-restrictions visit to Xinjiang, progress does indeed seem to have stalled. Western states have written letters, they've tried to join forces to some degree, but China has played that game back and better, and come back with letters signed by a higher number of signatories, including with multiple majority Muslim states. Sanctions have now been imposed by various states, including the UK, and China has responded with tit-for-tat sanctions against individuals, MPs, and indeed a barrister's entire chambers. Wringing our hands is not an option. The private art of diplomacy, which for all its many advantages, has fallen on deaf ears and aggressive diplomacy by China. The political sphere, constrained as it is by conflicting interests, is not producing results, and alone it will not put an end to the suffering or create the openness required to examine it in any legal sense. It is therefore now critical and urgent that every tool in the available box be deployed. The severity of the situation requires a multi-pronged, multilateral approach, one which requires a clear consideration of the space in which a state can both hear the political rhetoric on human rights, but also face the sharp end of action, of consequences for violations. The documented and detailed allegations which we've heard about must be pursued using all appropriate means available, including those by reference to international law and the international legal framework. Journalists, investigative teams, NGOs, and others are already working with courageous survivors and witnesses to bring testimony and evidence out. That evidence has already forced the Chinese state to defend itself, to deny the allegations, or to shoot the messengers with threats or sanctions. But beyond that, there appear to be few consequences that China faces from the international community other than reproach. There appear to be few active policies of atrocity prevention. Law alone will not provide simple solutions, but nor has any other approach. Working hand in glove with political and economic pressure and a prevention strategy, the gaps may start to be plugged. In order to deploy them, however, political will is required to bring pressure to bear. In the spaces between the words in quiet corridors and open letters, China is receiving mixed messages. International law can be used at least to concretize the message that the international community does take these allegations seriously and will not look the other way. The mechanisms available, and which I will shortly discuss, are not perfect. Some would say they're far from perfect. But they are what we have, and they can be used to far better effect, indeed to some effect, by states determined to prevent ongoing and future violations. The hand-wringing over the failures of the UN will not achieve a fixed and improved system, but the effective use of the mechanisms which do exist may start again to rebuild trust in an international system that just a few decades ago promised never again. I won't detail the documented allegations this morning. Most of you are aware of them and they're the subject of detailed discussion in other panel talks. But I will just say this to frame the context of the mechanisms and the legal framework. The allegations include the mass surveillance and arbitrary detention of over 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, torture and inhuman treatment of detainees, the forced separation of children from their parents, the denial of the right to practice their religion or speak their language, forced sterilization, forced labor, forced organ harvesting, enforced disappearances, and killings in detention. It is enough for me to say that much of the evidence is first-hand, detailed, and consistent. It has emerged for some time and continues to emerge even as this week we see news stories, for example, in the Atlantic. The weight that will be afforded to each of those sources will need to be tested in due course, and it's not for me to comment on those in the course of this talk. So, what are the obligations in international law? For those of you who are interested, our July 2020 paper contains far more detail than I can give you in this overview today. Instead, what I'd like to give you is a flavour of what is available and what can yet be deployed. China is a state party to a number of international human rights and international criminal law treaties, which prohibit it, or indeed others within its jurisdiction, from violating the rights of its citizens or committing crimes against them, which impose upon China in some instances a duty to prevent crimes or rights violations before they arise, and in particular serious crimes such as torture, genocide, slavery, and discrimination, and or which require China to fulfill a duty to punish perpetrators of crimes or rights violations when they occur. I want to refer in particular to the following 6 core human rights and international criminal law treaties, which are, amongst others, relevant to the violations and or documented allegations to date, and which may have been contravened. These include the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or CERD, and I will refer to that in some detail this morning, the Genocide Convention, the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment, CEDAW, or the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Child Rights Convention, and the Slavery Convention. Of course, as you all know, China has also signed the ICCPR, and as a signatory to that convention, it is under an obligation to refrain from committing acts that defeat the object and purpose of the covenant. Moreover, China is bound by norms of customary international law that include the prohibition of genocide, racial discrimination, slavery, and torture. These obligations are what is known as erga omnes in nature. In other words, they are owed to the international community as a whole. China's compliance with these obligations is therefore the concern of all states. And under each of those 6 treaties, China is required to take numerous steps in respect of the documented allegations and violations and or crimes against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. A number of the breakout sessions over this conference concern the question of genocide and or crimes against humanity in both the legal and the evidential sense, and of course the attendant obligations on both China and the international community. For now, I will limit my observations here to say only that there are credible accounts emanating from a number of bodies and organizations which raise grave concerns that serious human rights violations are being committed in Xinjiang against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, and which may include prohibited acts of genocide and or crimes against humanity. In due course, a court of law will have to test the forensic strength and reliability of various different accounts. The allegations raise particular concerns about a number of issues, including sexual violence and or other conditions of life calculated to destroy inflicted upon detainees. Allegations also raise particular concerns about gendered nature of the prohibited acts, with such acts constituting serious bodily and mental harm specifically directed against women and girls. And there are a number of others, such as those I mentioned earlier, and others that we heard about in the previous panel. If proven, and I do say if, because the lawyers in the audience and everybody else will know that the question of intent is a difficult question in international law. But if those are proven, given their frequency and pattern, they are likely to violate numerous provisions of the Genocide Convention. I just remind you that for genocide there needs to be proof of the requisite specific intent, i.e. the intent to destroy in whole or in part the protected group by high, mid-level and or low-level perpetrators of prohibited acts. As many of you know and appreciate, that is not an insurmountable hurdle to climb. But irrespective of whether that threshold is or can be met by a court in due course, state parties to the Genocide Convention have a duty, independent of China's own duty, to prevent genocide and or punish perpetrators of the crime. The ICJ has concluded that the obligation to prevent genocide contained in Article 1 of the Genocide Convention does have extraterritorial scope. As such, that means states that have the capacity to effectively influence other states do have a duty to employ all means reasonably available to them to prevent genocide, including in relation to acts committed outside their own borders. That duty is one of conduct rather than result. The obligation to prevent genocide is engaged from the moment the state learns or should know of the existence of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. So it is incumbent upon all states to consider, in light of the information available to them, whether genocide is being committed or whether there is a serious risk that genocide may be committed, and if so, to take all available diplomatic, legal, and other lawful measures to prevent that from taking place. And of course, and in this debate, we often don't discuss crimes against humanity, and there are real questions as to whether crimes against humanity should be considered a lesser crime. Because if 100,000 people, for example, and I'm not taking this example in a specific context, but if 100,000 people or 200,000 people are subjected to treatment that may constitute one or other, it shouldn't necessarily be worse because of the label. The obligation shouldn't necessarily look different because of the label. Acts such as enslavement, persecution, extermination, and torture, amongst others, when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population, constitute crimes against humanity. The prohibition of crimes against humanity is considered to be a peremptory norm. The UN General Assembly has affirmed the responsibility of states to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means to protect populations from crimes against humanity. And although China is not a party to the Rome Statute of the ICC, China retains a responsibility under customary international law to protect all persons in its jurisdiction from crimes against humanity, as well as to investigate and prosecute perpetrators of such crimes, including public officials and persons acting on behalf of the state. Moreover, the effective investigation and prosecution of crimes against humanity is not dependent upon a state's ratification of the Rome Statute. As the preamble to that statute recognises, effective prosecution of the most serious crimes of international must be ensured by taking measures at national level and by enhancing international cooperation. As an obligation owed to all states are under a customary international law obligation to investigate and prosecute crimes against humanity wherever committed. And so a number of states, in particular but not exclusively state parties to the statute, have implemented legislation, domestic legislation, enabling their own criminal courts to exercise universal or extraterritorial jurisdiction over crimes against humanity, regardless of the perpetrator's nationality and or where the alleged crimes were committed. In the absence of reliable domestic avenues in China for resolution, third-party states, including the UK, must be willing to use all such mechanisms as exist to enforce China's obligations under international law by requiring it to cease continuing violations of its international human rights obligations, to prevent future violations, and to provide a remedy for harm suffered. I emphasised at the outset the need for political will. They go hand in glove, operating as they do on state level. The current stalemate on Xinjiang, with much shaking of heads but little else, is demonstrating not just inertia but insufficient political will. It is true that part of this may be because there are real and considerable limitations upon holding China accountable in legal terms for alleged violations or crimes. China does not accept, where available, individual complaints procedures that would allow Chinese nationals to directly bring their cases before various UN committees, nor does it accept any inquiry procedures into serious and systematic abuses of human rights under these treaties. China has also expressly made reservations to deny jurisdiction on the ICJ in the event of a dispute as to the application, interpretation, and fulfillment of the treaty provisions. It has not accepted the competence of treaty-based mechanisms to receive interstate communications concerning its compliance with obligations under the treaties. In short, what this means is that individuals and states are not able to enforce China's obligations under most of these treaties in a formal court of law or an international independent impartial forum. There is, however, one important exception to this formidable list of reservations, and I would like to take a few moments to explain why I think it's important and worthy of pursuit. China hasn't made reservations to Article 11 of CERD, the Discrimination Convention. This means it's accepted the competence of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination to examine and adjudicate interstate disputes concerning alleged failures to give effect to the Convention. State parties to CERD, including the UK, may therefore request the committee examines alleged breaches of the Convention by China. The prohibition of racial discrimination is used cogens in character. The nature of the rights and obligations that arose under customary international law and CERD means that there is a requirement on all states to protect the rights and obligations under CERD. States other than China have a right, arguably a duty, to do various things. For example, to invoke responsibility of a state alleged to have violated CERD, to not consider violations as legal, with all the consequences that entails for both states, to ask for cessation of possible violations, and to request just satisfaction for victims of any violations, including commitments for non-repetition and arguably payment of reparation to victims, though reparations are not established by custom. States should also refrain from rendering aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by a breach of CERD. The interstate communications mechanism, CERD, does allow the state to formally communicate those grievances. In other words, that another state has allegedly violated the Convention. That's laid out in the procedures of the Convention. And if the state party is willing to submit such a communication to the Committee Against China, and if the jurisdiction admissibility of such a case were to be accepted, this is a viable option to hold it accountable. The procedure under Articles 11 to 13, is compulsory. There are multiple and detailed accounts emanating from a number of bodies, including the Committee on Eliminating Racial Discrimination itself, that Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims are discriminated against systematically. By these accounts, including the official leaks, discrimination is the very purpose. Discrimination, the othering, whether directly or indirectly of people according to one of their characteristics, is both the precursor and the ugly heart of genocide. China doesn't have this reservation to Article 11. So the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination does provide a means by which state parties can and should seek to invoke China's international responsibility with respect to its treatments of Uyghurs. There is prima facie evidence of discriminatory treatment of Uyghurs in many ways, and I won't set them out for lack of some time, but one of the things that hasn't come out so far in the sessions in any great detail is also the use of AI and technology to systematically discriminate against Uyghurs and Turkic Muslims. And some of you may be familiar with the Human Rights Watch report as well on that. And the question then is, why have states not adopted this route so far? My view is that states are or may be reluctant to go down this path because it's been so little trodden. Moreover, it doesn't have the glory, if you like, of an ICC conviction. And combined with the overall lack of political will, no single state wants to stir the nest. But it is potentially a step that has a much bigger footprint than might initially appear. One of the obvious challenges in the global political climate has been how to turn around opinion in Muslim-majority states that have so far, for geopolitical or economic reasons, been vocally supportive or at least muted on the allegations in Xinjiang in a way that they have not been against other populations facing oppression or atrocity crimes. A third, communication and any subsequent findings by the committee could be a powerful tool with which to sway public opinion and, in consequence, to achieve state support in those countries. Given that, for example, China has in fact had much less actual support for its role on the UN Human Rights Committee than previously, those sorts of findings may in fact act as a badge of shame for those countries that continue to support it. Small changes can be powerful indicators, and we do know that the Chinese state reacts to our adverse publicity. It cannot tolerate it. It may not be an interstate dispute in the ICJ, but it is an option that does exist and which may yet cause its own chain of consequences. For that reason, however imperfect the options are, it is one which I urge states, including my own, to take. I'm conscious a little bit of the time, and so I'm not going to talk through some of the other various options, but I simply highlight that you'll read some of them in our report, including the possibility of an advisory opinion from the ICJ, from various international organisations. Again, this has the capacity to carry great legal weight and moral authority, all of which can be used to turn an international tide. I want to say also that this is not an ideological war against China, and nor should it be. This is not to stigmatise China and or her great history, culture, and people. Facing up to our international obligations against the state should not be used or pursued as part of any populist anti-China rhetoric, which of course has real-world implications also for ethnic Chinese communities around the world in terms of increased hate crime and discrimination. It's important we continue to be focused and clear about why the Chinese state is being pursued and for what. But faced with the most serious documented and emerging concerns of systemic and persistent violations of the most serious human rights and customary international law norms, this is and should be a matter of grave concern to the international community as a whole. It is therefore the responsibility of all states to take all available measures to prevent any violations of international law from occurring, whether they're labelled genocide, crimes against humanity, or other grave human rights violations, to seek to bring an end to them and to call upon China immediately to cease those practices. That is the diplomatic, political, economic, and security space into which this message should be heaped. And that requires difficult and confronting choices by some states. The Chinese state should not be able to hear one thing and know that another will be done. The roots that exist in international law and through the international frameworks, imperfect as they are a means of showing consistency, stability, and commitment to human rights as set out in international legal and criminal standards, which are far more powerful than any other agenda. I wanted to say a couple of words, if I may. Thank you. Just about some other legal steps that I consider are particularly important. There is, of course, the possibility of steps being taken in domestic law, whether by way of universal jurisdiction or otherwise. But I want to focus just also for a moment on business and human rights, on supply chains. I know that there is a session on this tomorrow, so I'll keep my comments brief. It's a lecture in and of itself, I think, but it's one that I think is of considerable importance and effect, and I think it's one that should be pursued seriously, also to impact on that space, that mixed messaging space. Here I want to say a few words specifically about the UK. Despite some advances towards securing some forms of corporate accountability, the mechanisms, both through jurisprudence and enforcement, remain weak and provide limited and uncertain remedies for victims. And although there has been an announcement that the Modern Slavery Act will be strengthened, this body of piecemeal provision does not go far enough. A powerful step forward would be through the introduction of a law on due diligence, which will strengthen corporate accountability for human rights abuses. This would be in line with a global corporate trend ever since the adoption by the UN of the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. More recently, this has taken the form of specific human rights due diligence laws. For example, in France, the corporate duty of vigilance, which requires French companies of a certain size to establish and implement an annual vigilance plan. The German government too, the EU too, are all announcing proposed new legislation. In September 2020, a draft report was issued by the European Parliament, and a previous call by the UK Joint Committee on Human Rights for the introduction of such a law has gone unheeded. I think I saw Nusrat Ghani MP, who I know has also been talking about this very issue at the back of the room. I'm sure she'll have something to say about it later. Civil society organisations in the UK have launched a campaign calling for an effective law to require companies and investors to take action to prevent human rights abuses, worker exploitation and environmental harm in their global operations, activities, products, services, investments and supply chains. They have also prepared a useful set of considerations to be included in any new legislation which introduces a corporate duty. We know that this can and will have impact in Xinjiang. We know that such a law can and will have impact on companies, on economics, and on the perception of trade for China. In August 2020, the UK government announced a consultation on proposals relating to due diligence in supply chains, but only in relation to forest risk commodities. As presently envisaged, the duty is limited and will impact on a small number of companies working only in a specific field. It's unlikely to be as broad as the law being suggested and proposed and consulted by the EU. It would be a powerful step for the UK government to introduce a corporate duty of due diligence, specifically relating to human rights and in compliance with international standards. It would avoid the piecemeal nature of current provisions and proposals which are limited in scope and effect and which lack ambition to meet international standards. Soft law must become hard law. Consumer choice must become business sanction. That is the economic and business space into which this message should be heaped. Again, the message to the Chinese state should not be that it can hear one thing and know that something else will be done privately. As its economic power continues to grow, China itself will need to rely on an international law framework. It already does. It needs it for arbitration purposes, for the law of the sea, for contract, commercial decisions and transactions done every day. The promise of law and the rule of law is that it can and should apply to us all. And to that end, the most vulnerable and hidden communities amongst us should be protected by the systems created exactly to that end. But international human rights law, treaties and systems also requires the will of states, the funding of states, and the active support of the system by which they were created and embedded. That will, funding and support is needed now to ensure states are not able to commit grave human rights violations, whatever name or label is attached to them, with impunity. I commend to you the various suggestions that we made in our 2020 briefing paper, many of which have in fact been incorporated in the Foreign Affairs Committee report recently published. For time reasons, I won't go through them all with you now, but in conclusion, I want simply to thank the many journalists, investigative teams and scholars who've done so much to shine light on what is happening in Xinjiang. I want to pay immense tribute to the courageous survivors who've told their stories. And I want to hope that the multiple spaces of security, economics, and diplomacy in which mixed messaging to the Chinese state remains rife can and will be filled with the tools that are available and which include those provided by an international law framework that was built to mean never again. We can make that happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Schona JOLLY QC, for a very detailed and fine-tuned talk from the legal perspective. I found it both sobering but also a very powerful call to arms. So that leads us into a nice long lunch break today for some of us. Part of the reason for the long lunch break is that we also have a Stop Uyghur Genocide campaign workshop taking place over the lunchtime, which is led by Mia Hassanson-Gross from Newcastle and by Raima Mahmoud from Stop Uyghur Genocide. and by Dilnur Reyhan from the European Uyghur Institute. So that will be taking place in the Armstrong building. If you walk straight out of this door, turn left before the willow tree, walk up through the quadrangle, you will see the Armstrong building on your left, go up into the entrance there and up the spiral staircase, and you will find the room up there, Armstrong building 106. I will try to lead some of you there when the time comes. Otherwise, please enjoy the lunch. The lunch has been set out there now, and we will see you back here at 14:15. Thank you very much.